All right, we're now being recorded here in the Zoom Beit Midrash, or as a Zoom Beit Midrash. We're in Masechet Makkot, and we're on page 3a. And I'm going to just jump us right into a Mishnah, being that we're back after a week of no learning. So without further ado, except to say that we're dedicating our learning tonight in the memory of those who were murdered at Tree of Life Synagogue 3 years ago. I have here the photograph of those incredible souls. I learned more about them today from a call I was on. And here are the people who are in our thoughts: Cecil Rosenthal, David Rosenthal, Sylvan Simon, Bernice Simon, Jerry Rabinowitz, Richard Gottfried, Daniel Stein, Rose Mallinger, Melvin Wax, Joyce Feinberg, and Irving Younger. And please God, may our learning create more civility, may our learning create more peace, may our learning create more understanding, and the appreciation of the depth of culture, of each other's cultures. Okay, so in their memory, and tonight to get back to our Gemara 3a, I'm at the Mishnah that is Me'idin anu et ish ploni. So on the Vilna page, if you're using a Vilna, it's in the middle of page 3a, right in the middle. And if you're using, just by way of my knowing, is anyone using the art scroll this time around, or did everyone get a Steinsaltz, or is everyone using my shared screen? You have the art scroll, Barry? Okay. So I hadn't been doing that, but I wanted to turn everybody there if somebody was using it, so I'm glad to know you're using it. So you're on 3a, and it's 3a2 in the art scroll. Okay, so the Mishnah goes on. Here's the share screen. So the Mishnah says, Me'idin anu et ish ploni. Aryeh, I see your face because the Zoom boxes go away. Can you see the screen, the Gemara on the screen? Thumbs up for me, because you're muted. Just give me a thumbs up if you can see it.
I see fine, thank you.
It's there, right? The text is on your screen.
Yes.
Okay, good.
Yes.
Okay, so Me'idin anu et ish ploni. We have a case where witnesses come and they testify in regard to a man. Ish ploni is that generalized term for John Doe. Shegeresh et ishto. And what did he do? He divorced his wife. V'lo natan la ketubata. And he didn't pay the requirement of what the marriage contract requires him to pay. He didn't pay if she's divorced or she's widowed. The man who divorces her or widows her from the estate is required to pay a certain amount that is stipulated in the ketubah. And these witnesses come about a man who's divorced, obviously still alive, and they say that he did not give her the payment of the marriage contract. Ve'halo bein hayom uvein lamachar sofo litein la ketubata. But because we're talking about the issue of Eidim Zomamim, we're talking about these conspiring witnesses. And if they were to have said that, the question arises, meaning that we prove that these witnesses were conspiring witnesses. So the whole process of how we prove that is not in the Mishnah, but we consider this a case because we're in the rubric of the conspiring witnesses problem. Here it's a problem. Why in Makkot is it a problem? Because there are certain cases that will not exactly be easy under the law, like just completely able to be settled by way of the procedural and policy matters that the law provides. This is going to be one of those cases that's going to be an exception, at least a potential exception to the rule, by way of how we adjudicate the matter once they're determined to be conspiring witnesses. Whereas we've proven before from the Torah and from our limud, from our learning, that conspiring witnesses have to have the same sentence that they hoped to implicate someone with in the court. If these are considered now to be conspiring witnesses who said he divorced her and didn't pay his ketubah, one might think that the natural result of that case would be that the conspiring witnesses are responsible to pay the man what amount the ketubah stipulated, because just like they wanted this man to suffer financial loss by saying, no, he never paid the ketubah, if they're found to be conspiring witnesses by another two witnesses, remember that's the way that they're found out to be conspiring witnesses, that another two came and said can't be, wouldn't now the conspiring witnesses have to pay 200 zuz, let's say, that's the amount that's stipulated in the ketubah? Whatever they wanted that guy to pay, whatever they tried to implicate him in having not paid, in order to make him pay, in order to lose that money, shouldn't they get the same exact sentence if the law of conspiring witnesses says that conspiring witnesses have to be dealt the penalty that they tried to implicate the guy with? So they're guilty. Do they pay? So the Mishnah now comes and asks, having made all those assumptions that I just brought you through in terms of the case, the Mishnah now asks, V'halo bein hayom uvein lamachar sofo litain la ketubata. But isn't it the fact, isn't it the case that either today or tomorrow, this guy really is going to have to fulfill the payment of the marriage contract? In other words, if they made him pay right now to fulfill the marriage contract, wouldn't it be a matter of law that by law he would have to pay? Wouldn't he be liable to pay the payment that is stipulated in the ketubah? And that being the case, as Steinsaltz says, the witnesses did not conspire to render him liable to pay a sum that he wouldn't be liable to pay. He would be liable to pay it. So, if he's liable, then I'm really not causing him any financial harm. I'm just, at this point, in the bigger picture of things, in terms of ultimate fairness, not able to sit easy with the case that a guy who didn't pay his ketubah, that the conspiring witnesses that said that should pay the money, because maybe one day that actual husband would have to pay his ketubah. So they didn't cause him financial harm. They didn't cause him by way of, let's say, fraud and only fraud, even though they defrauded him. But they didn't cause him any financial loss that he wouldn't otherwise incur. So the Mishnah has a problem vis-a-vis the fundamental fairness of the issue, which at the heart of many of these discussions is the real issue that comes to the forefront. I think that there's a pursuit of potentially like fundamental weights and balances. Sometimes it feels like in heaven, and sometimes it feels like down here below. Like, how am I going to make a law? Remember, then they really did create the whole legal structure of conspiring witnesses. This is like a rabbinic construct. How am I going to create this law that sometimes they're going to pay him this money, the conspiring witnesses, but then he's going to have to pay the ketubah anyway? So what, they pay for his ketubah? Is that really how this system should work? Well, the next part of the Mishnah comes along and tries to help clarify what the penalty in money could really be vis-a-vis what the conspiring witnesses would be responsible for. So the sum of their payment could be calculated, and I inserted could be, the sum of their payment, because that's the way the Gemara reads it, by the way. The Mishnah actually is a little bit more prescriptive. The sum of their payment should be calculated as follows. Kama adam rotze litain biketuvata shel zo. Assess how much money another person would be willing to give in order to purchase the rights to this woman's marriage contract. It's kind of like a speculation kind of financial arrangement. Somebody who knows about finances can help me here. How much would not someone just give, but how much would somebody risk in order to purchase the rights of this woman's marriage contract? She'im nit almana o nit garsha. If she is widowed or divorced, in fact, the husband, either himself from his estate, from his assets, or if he died from his estate, would indeed be required to pay the price of the ketubah. So if I buy, on speculation, I buy the rights to that ketubah, it's kind of like I'm betting that in fact, either he's going to divorce her or she's going to be widowed, and that he's going to come now and collect that ketubah. It's kind of like you could sell the ketubah for such a possibility. And how much would someone be willing to risk to get that money? That's what the question is, not just give, but risk. But because what? The imeta, if she dies, what happens when she dies and he doesn't divorce her, and nor does he die and make her a widow? If she dies, Yirashena Bala, her husband inherits from her, and the one who purchased her marriage contract receives nothing. So here's the risk for the person who puts up the money for the ketubah. I am basically betting that he either divorces her or he dies and she becomes a widow. Because if she dies, the husband inherits from her all of what she's kind of brought to the wedding, to the marriage, and he gets all of that, as opposed to it returning to her. Now, how could someone risk any money? Why would someone risk any money? Because she might not just be getting 200 zuzim. She might be getting in return all of the property that she brings into the marriage. And that property many times is, if you will, listed, or its complete value is listed, because it could be either the property itself, like land, or it could be the value thereof and more. She could bring in other property that would, in his demise, revert to her, or if he divorced her, revert to her. So this is the kind of speculation that was out there. And perhaps the married couple wants the money, wants to take that money, the speculation money, because they are in need of whatever kind of sum of money that they could receive vis-a-vis their ketubah, and the assessment that's made about how much money one would have to give them in order to buy the rights to that woman's marriage contract. So an interesting kind of situation here where we say he's not going to be in the court of law. The conspiring witnesses are not going to be liable to pay marriage contract, because either today or tomorrow, the guy may widow his wife or die, but he also might die and be responsible, for that marriage contract. He might divorce her. So we basically look at the aiding, the conspiring witnesses, and say, well, we have to still know how much they're going to pay, because there's a penalty we want to determine. It's a fine. It's now a knas. And we want to know how to calculate that. So it's not the price of the ketubah, it's the price of that speculation. All right, just on the Mishnah alone. Clear?
No,
No.
Okay, so Richard?
Oh, yeah. What isn't clear, first of all, it isn't clearly stated, is that conspiring witnesses, from the explanation, it sounds like, what was the conspiracy? What were they falsely charging? Were they falsely charging?
Yeah, so
were they
here's the
falsely
case.
charging that she was divorced and didn't receive, or just that, or that the falsehood was that the truth was she was divorced, but she didn't receive. So which is it? Both? Is it one? Because it doesn't make sense if it's, because they seem to say later that in the future she may be divorced, and so that part isn't clear. The other thing, the concept is of how they're arriving at a value has analogies in modern commerce. I mean, it's companies factor accounts receivable all the time. That there are factors who will pay not the full amount, but will pay for the receivables on a company's books. So in other words, the company no longer is going to try to collect those bills that they're owed. They've sold that right to someone else, because some of those are never going to get paid, and some of them are, and so there's a price on the receivables. So it's that kind of thing that's going on. But what isn't clear to me is that first thing I said is, what is it that they falsely claimed?
Okay, so then we come here in the second deal, but most of the commentaries don't deal with that question at all. But Baruch Shekivanti, and I wasn't trying to make it more complicated than it was, but since you asked the question, I had the same question this afternoon. Wait a minute. Is it assuming a case of conspiring witnesses that, first of all and foremost, they're saying that he divorced her? Forget the ketubah for a second. What about the first half of the issue? The reason why I didn't bring that up at all is because most commentators reject the idea that the question is about the divorce at all. They assume, and they read the Mishnah straightforwardly as, okay, this guy divorced his wife. And now he didn't pay. But either way, they're saying that he did an action or two actions and putting him on the block. Because if they're trying to say that he divorced his wife, that obligates him for the payment. So really it's two that are one. And this is how it's explained by commentators. So even if you think that it's two different kind of hiyums, meaning that he's either married or divorced, and that he did pay or he didn't pay, what the idea here in the Mishnah is, the case is one big long string of kiyums. That is, he divorced her and he didn't pay. So now, what's the ultimate? They're trying to make him pay. Let's say it was 200 zuzim. They're trying to make him pay 200 zuzim. So that's really the issue in the first half of the Mishnah. By way of, thank you for the parallel by way of the receivables, because that's kind of what, I think that's called the speculations market, but I'm just not sure exactly what the right terms are in the financial world. But yes, that's exactly it. Somebody's going to ultimately collect a ketubah like that. Somebody's not going to collect a ketubah like that. And it's a matter of risk. How much you would pay to risk that, what goes on in that relationship. I guess, without genetic records and insurance records, they couldn't know more than we might know if we had some insight into a person's bill of health. But maybe they knew a brother or two or something about the family's medical history, or maybe they're simply risking it. And again, the couple themselves, which is the twist that I'm putting, might be so much in need of some income at the time that they actually sell that ketubah in partnership, right? In partnership, because if she has a lot at stake, she may not want to let that go. Dale, what were you going to say? Oh, I'm sorry, Richard, you have a follow-up?
Yeah, no, it was just that taking that, okay, there was a divorce and he didn't pay, but that's a false accusation,
That's
which
right.
means he did pay. So,
Which means he did if the divorce is real, but the whole thing was found to be conspiring. They just wanted him to pay $200 because he says that there was a divorce. They say there was a divorce and he has to pay, right? So you're right to splice it, but the issue is the money that they are making him pay. You're right, though, that if he did divorce and it includes the divorce and he did pay versus didn't pay, he was out that money. That's why the end of that little part of the Mishnah says, but one day he would be obligated. So what do we do with the fact that these conspiring witnesses tried to get another 200 out of him? So you could take it that direction and say the divorce was real and he paid, and they tried to, say that he didn't. And now what do we do? They were found to be conspiring. Well, what's their penalty? Is it 200? No, he owed her the 200. In the end, the second part of the mission, he owed her the 200. So what is the penalty we're going to assess? The amount that they would be willing to pay vis-a-vis the speculation on what the ketubah was worth. Dale.
So this all doesn't make sense to me, but let me try to just articulate three questions. One is, what is the punishment if he refuses to pay? Because it isn't the 200 zuzim, it's also the 200 zuzim, but is the court now just going to ignore that there's a punishment? And is the punishment different if he doesn't pay because he doesn't want to, or because he doesn't have the money? And why is it that lying about this, if the ketubah has no value, if nobody is going to pay for it, then that means that the two conspiring witnesses don't get punished at all. And it's hard for me to believe that there's enough market for buying ketubahs in this risky way that this helps, that it doesn't establish what the price would be. So the whole construct seems problematic to me. And I'm sure the Gemara gives us explanations and assumptions, but by itself, it makes no sense.
Not really. The Gemara doesn't really go into a lot of depth here, so which is an interesting piece. It kind of presents this case as if to say something's going to get muddy when witnesses come and testify as to a divorce and as to whether or not someone fulfilled a ketubah obligation. And we're going to find out one time that they actually came in, they're conspiring witnesses, and whether or not it was all one kiyum, meaning there was a divorce and he didn't pay, or it was two different ones, like they're saying he divorced her when he didn't and he didn't pay, and therefore they're trying to shake 200 out of him so that they, who knows what, they made a deal that they're going to get 100 each or something like that from this, scenario. I don't know. We don't know the fullness of the case, but we know that if they were found to be conspiring witnesses, because we're in the rubric of conspiring witnesses, and they are lying, we can't really just say that the penalty for conspiring witnesses is the price of the ketubah. Because
I was
one
suggesting
day,
it should be more than that because there's a punishment involved. There should
yeah,
be a punishment.
it feels like that, but in this case, the Mishnah is not ruling that it should be more than that. And even though you're making a very good point, to be true to the text, they say, well, we can't use the value of the ketubah because one day this guy could really have to pay that ketubah, and it's no real financial loss that these conspiring witnesses are causing this guy. And when they're thinking about the system that they're creating, as opposed to the application of punishment for people who are scheming and conspiring, but I think they're thinking about the nature of the system, the fairness within the system, which is why I pointed that out in my explanation. I think that they're trying to feel like, okay, do we really have an ultimate loss of money? Now, they could have concentrated very much on the conspiracy. They could have concentrated on how these guys schemed. They could have concentrated on any of that and made this punishment more severe, or the fine more than the price of the ketubah, to try to create some reason to steer clear of potentially raising this conspiracy, even, right? That we want the penalty to be there so that people can realize how deep a crime this is, right? Because you can't go around cheapening the ketubah. You have to respect this institution. All it symbolizes, the marriage that it symbolizes, and the relationships and the truth that's within ketubot. And plus, like, you're ruining the reputation of this potential husband. And remember, in the rabbinic world, to be married from both sides, from the men's side and from women's side especially, but from both sides, to be married is a really important institution in life. And so they could have made it bigger, but they say here, surprisingly, they really didn't cause him any harm that way, by way of the money that he would owe vis-a-vis the ketubah. So what is the penalty that we're going to assess? And they use this calculation, and the calculation seems to be on this speculation about whether or not the money's receivable. And
Well,
so
it's different from lashes. If they are found to be conspiring witnesses before someone is lashed, they still are subject to lashes.
No. So here, remember, we're in Mishnayot that are displacing Makkot. Davka.
But why is the rule different? Because it's money compared to lashes.
Because it's a ketubah, because it's this case, because it's related to this particular case. We have no whys. They're not philosophizing about exactly why they're telling you that this is the case and these are the calculations now, and this is how we're going to penalize. We don't have that why, but they're trying to establish a way of having a payment and having a fine. Barry, I saw you had your hand up.
Yeah, where's the woman? This whole thing is so bizarre to me. We have one person who actually knows the facts about whether or not she did or did not get a get delivered to her. It just baffles me that we're having this discussion as if the woman is totally invisible. Was a woman not allowed to testify? What am I missing, Rabbi?
Yeah. Well, in general, you would think that she has some standing. In general, we say the general kind of rule is that they don't have standing, not as witnesses, and maybe not to their own witnessing. I would imagine some courts in practice, if there were real batei din in function, if there were beit dins in function, that she probably was asked, and someone maybe had to testify as to the verity of all she says, or sometimes there might be this little sidebar conversation where her truth be told. The idea of her presence, though, is in the contract itself. And in the notion that in this ancient theater, the idea that a marriage contract even exists and that there's an obligation by husbands towards their wives, should they divorce them and or die, and
Right.
that there can be a list of assets that she brought to the marriage.
You know, I got all of that, but let me just play this out. Unless I'm totally have missed everything here, the only way this works for the conspirers is if they conspired with the woman, right? I mean, because the money that he's going to have to pay, he's going to have to pay to her. Or am I missing something there?
Well, that's why I suggested kind of as part of the narrative that as a possibility could be like, it sounds like a little bit, yeah, there's some collusion here even. And that's a weird kind of sense of what's going on with this notion. Again, if their partnership led to being able to sell the speculation, the rights to this ketubah in the end, and we think about it in a more kind of purer way, and that's why they take this, like Dale was probably right, it's probably not a huge market, but sometimes that might have happened, and maybe people had serious wealth, enough land to have it be quite a high price. And maybe the cases that would come out like this are the more high stakes, bigger economics involved kind of cases that seem to puzzle them. And so here we have the way to really assess the penalty, that is to assess how much someone was willing to pay. Really, what is it? Them, but her, because she's losing all of that. So her presence as someone who stands to lose a lot of assets that she would gain upon her being divorced or her being widowed is really at stake. And the ketubah protected, in the end, the ketubah tried to protect her. So that's, if it's not conspiracy with her, collusion with her, it is somewhat a matter of her being present in the conversation and are trying to figure out what's the best way to penalize these guys who are trying to take 200 zuz out of this guy. And you're right, how would they get the 200 zuz if it was going to be a payment that they tried to make him pay to her without any of that? So we're not exactly sure because we don't have all the details listed. Ron.
I have a completely different scenario. And I don't know if it's your scenario or my scenario is right, but my scenario is that he did pay the woman the ketubah, and the two edim zomemim say he didn't pay, and that came to court, and now you can value how much somebody will buy that ketubah to punish them to pay that because they are edim zomemim. So it's a little bit completely different.
It's actually the simplest way to understand it, and the straightforward, not simple like as in it, you're not understanding it. That's the simplest narrative, that once he was made to pay or not made to pay, but they wanted to really say that he should be out another 200 because this is our sister and they want an extra 200 in the family. Right? That if they're found out to be conspiring witnesses, you're right. Let's take it just on this simple, straightforward. This is their penalty. How much would the speculations market allow for that ketubah to be sold? And that's their penalty. That's their fine.
In the art scroll, though, they say that one of the principles was that you can't make a claim about someone not doing something because you don't know if they did it when you weren't looking. I don't know, Rabbi, how, but that's
part of what the second pair of witnesses can say, and that's why the art scroll brings that up, is if they were not there all the time, right, and they don't have they can't testify that he gave her the 200 zuz, but then took it back. He gave her the 200 dinars and then took it out of her hand, right? There was some action, but that gets into a philosophical discussion that is an undercurrent of this entire Masechta and in Sanhedrin, by the way. Like how much about things not being done do we believe from witnesses? And that's a big question that runs in many different kind of both criminal and civil areas of the law. Richard.
Not to belabor this, but it occurs to me on Barry's point that it seems clearest, the explanation and their reasoning seems clearest if the wife was part of the conspiracy, was one of the conspirators. Then it all makes sense, because then it's clear. Then it says, because then when they're valuing it, they say, well, she might be entitled to it eventually anyhow because he may divorce her, or maybe she predeceases him, and then they're going to get nothing. So now it's speculative. So now they're selling it. So under that scenario, everything seems, in my mind, seems to come together and clear if you assume that the woman is the wife is one of the conspirators.
Yeah, I want to judge her on the scale of merit. Let's say that she wasn't. Let's say that she got her money, like Ron said, and let's say that these two came along and said, you know what, this guy's been a real schmuck to our sister. We're going to go to court and we're going to demand 200, dinars with or without her. And they get the court to rule because they sound really kosher, like he never paid the money. But, here comes our Mishnah. They're conspiring witnesses. They're Eidim Zomim. They're found out. Can I charge them at 200? No. What do I do? How much would someone be willing on the market to pay for the rights to that ketubah and the value that it was at? So, really good exploration. This is exactly what sometimes a Mishnah can do in a way that we learn it as a group, right? Because we've now really parsed this in lots of different ways and refined our understandings and taken issue with some of the assumptions. And we don't have all the whys, and we for sure don't have all the case details. Meanwhile, you know that I love simply the Jewish books for Jewish books' sake. And so what I want to scroll to for a second is not our text. Take a look at the side. I'm going to reduce it, actually. Take a look at what Steinsaltz put on the side here. He has a picture of what?
A ketubah.
Ketubah, an illuminated Venetian 18th century ketubah. Now, if I was, Stam Yid, I was just reading my Steinsaltz and appreciating everything Rabbi Steinsaltz did for me, and I lived in the 20th century and I wasn't curious, I would say, oh, all of our ketubahs look like that throughout the years. But if I knew something about illuminated ketubahs, or ketubahs that have any degree of illumination or illustration or artfulness, then I would realize that from the 17th to the 21st now centuries, illuminated ketubahs like these have been really a wonderful part of the ketubah tradition. But that history was not necessarily the one to rely upon. Like a picture like this can be a little deceiving because I might think that it happened all throughout Jewish history. The reality is it really didn't happen like this. Ketubahs weren't really created and painted like this and illuminated and illustrated and made so decorative for Jewish brides. So I want to just take you on a little bit of a journey into what has been discovered about ketubah. So the first landmark article was from an annual from 1955 by a scholar named Franz Landsberger, who talked about illuminated marriage contracts. And he's working with a collection in Cincinnati, and he's thinking about everything that's found in the Cairo Geniza, and he's thinking about what we know from Rabbi Solomon Schechter in that Geniza with all those fragments in England, and the content of fragments, the cachet of fragments we have at JTS at that library. And so considering the uniqueness of ornamented Jewish marriage contracts, we are not surprised that these have been sought after by museums, libraries, and private collectors. The Hebrew Union College Museum can pride itself on the possession of a large and perhaps the largest extant set of these documents, 111 to be precise. This makes it all the more astounding that research has accorded the subject but scant attention. Okay, so scant attention. Origin and development. As regards the ornamental ketubah's place in life, I would call the reader's attention to the illustration here given of a Jewish marriage ceremony pictured on an English Torah binder. Here's a 1733 English Torah binder, a marriage ceremony. That's in the 18th century. But our next question is, when did the Jews begin the practice of ornamentation? Our earliest sample goes back to the 11th century. It consists of a fragment of a vellum ketubah found near Fustat, a suburb of Cairo, and today preserved in the Bodleian Library at Oxford, England. The modest decoration consists of two intersecting arches marked with circular patches. And here is a picture of that original arched ketubah, 11th century Fustat. Pretty cool that documents back in Rambam's time had some decorative elements and illuminations, mostly decorative. We didn't find too much illumination qua the actual use of foils or any kind of inks. And that's Fustat, about 11th century. For 4 centuries, the one from Fustat remains a solitary example. The next of the ornamented ketubahs known to us dates from a time not earlier than the end of the 14th century. That's written on vellum, produced in the year 1392 in Austria. It's in the State Library in Vienna. Now, what's interesting is that at about that time, in the 14th century and the 15th century, we see that, and these are 20th century ketubot, but we will see here that, hold on one second, the origins of decorated ketubot in medieval Spain were discovered. Ornamented ketubot are now commonplace in most Jewish communities. Decorating a ketubah, and this is a claim of the University of Washington Sephardic Studies program, but we just read the HUC annual, which discredits this claim. But anyway, the claim here is first emerged as a distinctly Sephardic practice. Sephardim have been decorating ketubot since at least the 14th century, when the Iberian Rabbi Shimon ben Semach Duran published a responsa, or rabbinic legal decision, saying that ornamented ketubot were not only permissible, but could actually protect the integrity of the document. I think I lost my share there. Did I lose my share?
You did.
I'm sorry. Let me try it again. Well, did you hear me at least speak about Rabbi Shimon ben Semach Duran?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So just to read you from his text without sharing the screen for a second, here's what he said. When asked about the ornamentation and decoration, here is we have the first tshuva about it that we know. So the University of Washington Sephardic Studies program, I think, could claim that the first halachic material that dealt with decorative ketubot, the art of ketubot, definitely was a Sephardic invention, but we saw from the HUC annual that, in fact, we know that there's an 11th century Cairo Geniza fragment that predates the decorative ones of Spain. But what did the rabbi say? What did Rabbi Shimon ben Semach Duran say in Sefer Tashbetz? Ulefi ze yashar be'enai Ma shenahagu b'ketubot chatanim lekalot shelahem. Here is what I say about those who ask me whether or not the ketubot of brides and grooms can have any decoration. Litzayer b'tziurin ufesukim begilayon. When they put verses from our Tanakh and decorative elements on the marriage document. Ulefi shenahagu la'asot gilayon gadol. And when they made them oversized and not just a piece of paper that had enough space for the words of the official legal document. What about those larger size ketubot with lanoi umiluotan ba'otan pesukim v'tziurim? And what do we say when they were filled with verses and lettering and calligraphy and decorative arches and elements on larger scale ketubot? Bishvil shelo yachtemu ha'edim barosh shita tachat shtorei haktuba v'yishar gilayon panui. And what if the edim sign here and there's still other kinds of things below them? And what do we do? And so what he says is that davka sheneda et ketubata, we will know the very nature of that woman's ketubah if it is artfully created with these verses, illuminations, calligraphy, and art elements. So what he did for the world of illuminated ketubot in Spain is to give a hechsher, to make kosher, this production of an oversized ketubah like the one that Steinsaltz has on our page from Vienna, much later, many centuries later. But he gave a hechsher for that ketubah to be decorated in such a way that even contained holy verses and these decorative elements that we find. So a wonderful kind of beginning of some other kind of different project. Now, one other element that I'll share with you is that in Sephardic ketubot, there were many variations. So not all of them became illuminated ketubot. Not every ketubah is a decorative ketubah. You can have a ketubah that's a piece of paper and the legal words and not have a single element of art or calligraphy or illumination. And as long as the edim, the witnesses, sign, you're fine. Can I add any other kinds of details? Well, our Mishnah already talked about the bride's kind of state and that property which she brings to a marriage might have been listed as part of the document. And it might have been written in. Or if there was a dowry, Sephardic families invested in expensive dowries as a status symbol. And this part of the ketubah was read at weddings. So the nature of financial dealings within ketubahs is part of the tradition. And I'll just show you one fragment of a dowry assessment from the Jewish community of Rhodes that I have on my screen now. So you see here where there is a detailed list of the bride's dowry. Instead of only listing the standard sum of dowry money determined by Jewish law, wealthy Sephardic families invested in expensive dowries as a status symbol. And when this part of the contract was read aloud at weddings, all guests would know just how well off the bride's family was. The dowries were not only recorded on the ketubah, in some places, such as on the Mediterranean island of Rhodes, the Jewish community kept centralized records of their bride's dowries, and they found parallel documents with the dowries in the Rhodes manuscripts so that you would see them. The ketubot from the Ottoman Empire had to stipulate monogamy. So you had elements such as that could be added into decorative ketubot. And writing the ketubah text and decorating it were distinct disciplines, they said. Painters would often decorate a ketubah as a template, and a scribe would fill in the contractual text later. Today, some people have decorative ketubahs that are done by artists, and those same artists actually pen the calligraphy. So depending on who you hire for your decorative ketubah, you could have the same person actually do the actual calligraphy or not. So just a quick kind of look at Rabbi Steinsaltz's new kli for us, this tool we have of the Steinsaltz translation and the picture that he puts in, and what it might lead us towards thinking about the Mishnah we're reading, and without the kind of exploration a little bit to think about, okay, what are we talking about by way of ketubah? And ketubah, most likely in the Tannaitic era, is a document with absolutely no illumination, decoration, or fanciful calligraphy. It is a straightforward contract. And we found in the Essene community, which is the Dead Sea Scrolls community, we found fragments of what earlier scholars called ketubot, but which were most likely different kinds of agreements and not the rabbinic ketubah nusach that we have, but early documents from Gaonic era, and some people believe one from the end of the rabbinic era, shows the exact kind of standard, mostly standard Ashkenazic nusach. There's a whole book about the history of the nusach itself of the ketubah, but you see that Steinsaltz says above the marriage contract on the page, if you have the book, the contract includes a lien on the husband's estate to ensure payment of a minimum sum that he's liable to pay if she is divorced or widowed, 200 dinars for a virgin bride, 100 dinars for other brides. These minimum sums have remained in force throughout the centuries up until the present day, though marriage contracts have almost always stipulated a good deal more money in practice. So sometimes I'll say, if you're thinking seriously about your ketubah not just being symbolic, we could write in much more to what is owed the bride in the case of divorce or the death of the spouse. And of course, now with Sohar, which is the Orthodox group in Israel, and the Orthodox Union, and the Rabbinical Assembly, which is the conservative assembly of rabbis, there are halachic prenuptials. There are agreements that people kind of can come to the marriage with their own assets and then take away their own assets, and that financial liabilities aren't going to be ultimately a matter of the court's determination, but the family kind of goes through some of that in a kind of halachic, a new halachic framework to be an additional kind of document that's prepared and signed on the day of the wedding. So the fact that we make it a little bit legal and a little bit financial is where the woman's presence throughout our entire history has a unique kind of place, because she was promised, should there be a dissolution of the marriage and or his death. All right, so that's the brief history. Yeah, Ron.
Do you know if there is now a new way that a woman gives the ketubah to the man nowadays, if she is richer than him?
I actually have not encountered that, nor have I encountered that question. So I would have to put out that question on a rabbinic list and see if that's ever been the case. So yeah, interesting question.
Could be.
I mean, sometimes in history, when she was richer, what would be listed is all the stuff that she brought to the wedding and what is her assets. And then to pay that ketubah upon divorce or his death, she would get all that back.
Yeah,
but nowadays a woman wants to divorce the husband, not only the husband wants to divorce the woman.
Yeah, that's very true. But have not had that kind of approach.
The art scroll talks about, in addition to the sort of fixed payment and what she brings to the dowry in terms of these very specific things, which become the joint property, and she's entitled to an economic equivalent in money if the marriage dissolves. But it also identifies, if she's really rich, she can set aside other property that does not go into the common pot, stays with her but her husband is allowed to benefit from essentially the interest on that, or, you know, the proceeds, if it's, you know, they use the feathers of a chicken or something like this as the metaphor. So you're not taking the chicken, you're just taking
The feathers?
which will grow back or whatever. But I thought that was really fascinating, that if she's really rich, she actually doesn't have to throw all of it into the communal pot. She can actually hold it out, but her husband gets the benefit of it in terms of the interest equivalent during the time when the marriage is in force.
Right. That's some of what Ketubot, Masechet Ketubot, will be all about in rabbinic law. And yeah, that drills down into that Ketubot kind of parsing out what people come to with the marriage. Thank you for bringing.
Rabbi,
Yeah,
I just wanted to ask you about the look, the appearance of the ketubah. I didn't understand what you said about that the rabbi who said that you're allowed to have it larger because why? What was the reason that he said that was permissible?
Reasoning in his tshuva is that if I have a larger document and I have unique decorations and calligraphy and certain verses versus another, say ketubah, that has its own artist and its own painter, or even if I use a standard kind of painterly way of doing this, I have a different calligrapher who does a more fanciful script this way versus this guy who has a block script or a Babylonian script, I will be able to know that it's definitely and definitively her ketubah or their ketubah. In other words, the more unique it is, like the more that you'll know it's yours. So I'll give you for example about how that came to fruition for Amy and me. I loved a certain decoration of an artist in Philadelphia. I loved his artwork for the ketubah. So I measured out what was previously like, I guess, prepared text, standard text, printed text in the middle of that ketubah. But I sized that out and then hand wrote my own document on a unique rag paper that I could paste into this rectangle in our ketubah. So that Amy, if she's looking at Jonathan's artwork around the country, he probably did 200 of these lithographed ketubahs. But Amy would know, based on the ketav yad, based on my handwriting and my writing the document in the middle, that that's her ketubah, even if it was sitting next to someone's who had the same artwork and was using the standardized printing, right?
Yeah. And now I want to go back to that Venetian one that was so very beautiful and that I couldn't see very clearly, but even, you know, on a very indistinct image on the screen, it's very elaborate, and it almost seemed to me as though there was some kind of landscape or cityscape on top. And on the very top, it almost looked like a family crest, which we don't think of as being very Jewish. So
it was the Ottoman. It was the Ottoman.
No, not the Ottoman. The Ottoman had the moon and the star. This was the Venetian one with the two arches. And there was the first one that you showed us. That's in this. Is it in the Steinsaltz or?
Yeah.
I have seen family crests on ketubahs.
They
did exist in Vienna at least.
Uh-huh.
And I don't think for very many people, but they did exist.
This
This
looks very Italianate from a half a second of a blurred image.
I'm going to try to pull it up for you. I was looking.
I said Vienna, I meant Venice.
Venice.
Yeah, I found it here, so I'm going to pull it up for you on the screen.
Yeah.
So this is the one that Steinsaltz highlighted.
Yeah, so it looks
So-
like, it looks almost like a crest or something with the crown and with the feathers. I mean, it's very noble looking.
It is.
And
This,
then it's like a cityscape where you have these two different
Yes.
cities and something in the center that looks,
this is the Dome of the Rock. And what is amazing
Ah.
about Italian ketubahs, and I highly commend the Italian synagogue in Jerusalem's museum, and you can go see some of these in person. It is amazing that they gave prominence of place right in the middle. Instead of using Migdal David, instead of using David's Tower, Jerusalem found its place in these ketubas and the hills of Judea,
Right.
because the brides and grooms would be rejoicing right out there. Kol sasan v'kol simcha, kol chatan v'kol kala. They gave a private place to this Dome of the Rock, which became a symbol of a wonderful cultural shared Jerusalem in the 18th century into the 19th century, in Italian ketubot particularly. And over here, there are those who see this not as family crest, but as keter, as being some image of God. And if you look closely, there's been debate about whether or not there's like a human figurine in here, like the bride herself is supposed to be Malka, the queen. So it's kind of giving a sense of bride as royalty. And the idea that brides and grooms were royalty on their wedding day is well founded in texts.
And they have the signs of the Zodiac.
Yes,
got
and
the Zodiac signs all around.
Zodiac, which, you know, in terms of marriage and appropriate times, Meira could probably talk, give us a whole
Mazal Tov.
yeah, but a Mazal Tov in the notion of when you're married. And look at how they use a little bit of Aramaic to very especially connect with the notion of an ancient history. B'simana tova uv'mazala me'aliyah. They say, instead of mazel tov, they say a holy and a high and a raised a heilige kind of mazel, the one that comes up at the right time in the sky, to connect it to the astrological symbol that maybe this couple found out that this is the timing that we should ultimately get married. Remember that the story in the Gemara about Rabbi Akiva's daughter is that she puts a pin through an attacking scorpion just because the right constellation is up in the sky, despite the tension in the Gemara that they say we don't really rely on those constellations. There is evidence in the Gemara to say that, in fact, we see that as quite a way to calculate the ripe and right times for a wedding. On this ketubah, by the way, you see on the left-hand side that there's Tanaim, conditions that the families set out. It would be sometimes in those conditions, like Barry, you were saying about the laws of what she brings, or the property she brings, sometimes it would be in the Tanaim, in the arrangements, and this would be written in first, sometimes a year or months before the actual day of the wedding, and the ketubah would be written at a different time, and you can have two different scribes, which probably is the reality here. Look at the beautiful Tanaim in the Ketav Yad, in the script, and then you have the block. Could have been the same one because of the Keter, because of the title over here of the conditions. It might look like the text. So these are amazing documents. Getting back to your question about family crests, I'm not exactly familiar with the one, Daily, that you mentioned that has a family crest, but this is a beautiful ketubah that that is in rotation, I believe, at that museum in Jerusalem. And I might have, there was a show in Florence at one point. So if you're in Florence and you go to the Uffizi, then you can make your way to the Florence great synagogue there, the Florence Choral Synagogue, and you can see they have some in their collection too. Beautiful, beautiful work.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. So those are exciting portraits to me. Back to our text. So a little bit back into the history and now back into our text. Where is the Gemara? Let me find it again. Hello, where are you? Where did you go? Here it is. Okay, so on the screen you should see again, there was the Mishnah. Now the Gemara
We're not
Wants
seeing
to-
it.
We're not
You don't
seeing
see-
it.
We're
You
not
know-
seeing any.
We got the Zoom logo.
How about now? Are you seeing it?
Yeah,
Yes.
Okay, so the Gemara says, Ketzad Shami. So if we establish that the payment takes into consideration the risk one would make to receive that sum of money, we're going with that. How does the court actually assess that sum? Rav Chisda, Amar Rav Chisda, Ba'al. One calculates the sum in terms of the husband. How much would one be willing to pay for the husband's rights to the marriage contract based on the likelihood that his wife will die first? So in other words, if she dies first and the husband inherits, that's the way we measure. So how much would that be worth? Rav Nathan bar Oshaya Omer, Be'isha. No, it's not vis-a-vis the husband's potential for collecting that receipt. Nathan bar Oshaya says, we calculate the sum in terms of the wife, meaning how much would one be willing to pay for the wife's rights to the marriage contract based on the likelihood that the husband is the one to divorce her or die. So we have a disagreement as to kind of from whose perspective are we ruling? And there's only one more little piece of Gemara on this whole case. Rav Papa says, Amar Rav Papa, who agrees, by the way, with Rav Natan bar Oshaya, but just has a little bit of a diuk, has a little bit of a distinction. And he says, Ba'isha uvichtu bata. One calculates the sum in terms of the wife, as Rav Natan bar Oshaya said, and the assessment's done in terms of her marriage contract. And Rashi explained there that Rav Papa and Rav Natan are really agreeing without factoring the husband's loss of the profits from the use of property that his wife has brought to the marriage, which Barry mentioned before. This is where we were going to really think and take that into consideration. We kind of just do it based on the amount that he would collect from the ketubah and kind of its purest value without this whole issue of interest from use of property. So that's all the Gemara says vis-a-vis this kind of speculation. Are we really speculating about it based on how much someone would risk vis-a-vis the husband collecting? Or are we speculating based on the woman collecting? Obviously, and for Dale, this wasn't so obvious. So I'll use the term thoughtfully here, but obviously there was a market, some kind of market for buying this risk.
this sounds like credit default swaps to me.
A little bit, right? A little bit of.
No, it's a derivative market from the underlying actual contractual relationship.
Exactly.
Do you
Derivative
know
market.
if that is referenced anywhere else in the Talmud?
The derivative market,
Yeah,
paying for risk. Well, this discussion, if it's not in the Talmud about the assessment of this amount of speculation, is definitely in halachic texts. And it moves into the Torah and it moves into the Shulchan Aruch. So I'm going to imagine that it's in the Yerushalmi, though I've not learned Yerushalmi Ketubot. So we would have to look. And in Masechet Ketubot, you get a little bit. All right.
The bad part of this is death is a key event here, which could really get you into deep trouble in terms of having some people out there who might benefit from your no longer being alive. So I think you'd really want to be careful as to who you might want to sell this to.
Yeah, well, the bottom line, right, is that you could be really risking your life.
The way I read it, that would not be improbable.
I mean, what's crazy is we're going to get into discussions later about, kind of like Are Miklat, right? Refuge cities. Sounds like a very interesting concept somewhere between imprisonment for manslaughter and living somewhat of a normal life in this refuge city, right? But remember, you're only a prisoner there, or you're only confined to the refuge city until the death of the Kohen Gadol. A little dangerous to be the Kohen Gadol if the wrong person's sent to the city of refuge. So we have to be very careful in these matters to, let's say, inhibit those with grievances. We want to be very careful.
Right. So did you ever, some people may be too young to remember $1 a Second, the Jan Murray TV show, where the contestants got $1 a second and they had to keep doing things to stay on. But there was what they called an outside event. And this was something totally that was separate from what was going on stage. Like when I remember they put a pearl into an oyster among hundreds of oysters, and they had someone shucking the oysters. And when they got to the pearl, then they would lose all of their money. If the outside event came in, they lost all of their money.
You mean if they didn't stop? In other words, they had to.
But if they were still going and collecting $1 a second, if this happened, this would wipe away their entire benefit.
Right.
Outside events.
Time it right, and hope that outside event does not occur. All right, a little bit more Mishnah now, because we've learned our Mishnah Gemara for that little Mishnah and Gemara, and now we have a different case. And again, we're in the rubric of conspiring witnesses, and so we're looking at cases that are going to give us a little tsuris with the rubric, or at least that we're going to have to determine whether or not Makkot will come and be the penalty instead of the exact kind of sentence that the conspiring witnesses wanted to thrust on some innocent soul, or fines, because at this point we see that money talks. And so the next Mishnah comes along. Let me share the screen. So the Mishnah is on the end of 3a. Me'idin anu be'ish ploni. We have here again the John Doe. Shehu chayav l'chavero elef zuz. That he owes another person 1,000 dinars. Almanat litnan lo mikan va'ad shloshim yom. So they say that he has to agree that, or they say that he made a loan with the stipulation that he has 30 days to pay back the money. Shloshim yom. So that's what they testified. He borrowed 1,000 dinars, and that he'll pay between now and 30 days. V'hu omer, but the borrower says, mikan va'ad eser shanim, not 30 days. That's not the condition of the loan. I took that loan with a 10-year repayment period. 30 days? What? So, what happens? Those witnesses who testified that he had only 30 days to pay back the loan are found to be conspiring witnesses. Eidim Zomamim. This is the assumption of our Mishnah, that we would understand that the case is being brought because we are discussing the rubric of Eidim Zomamim. So the idea here is if there's such a dispute that's found to be true, Omdim kama adam rotzei litain, v'hiyu biado elef zuz, bein notnan mikan v'ad shloshim yom, bein notnan mikan v'ad eser shanim. So how am I going to penalize conspiring witnesses in this case? The court now figures out how much money a person would be willing to give to actually keep a loan of 1,000 dinars in his possession. You've got the money. How much would you be willing to pay to keep it in your possession? 30 days time, and what the difference is vis-a-vis how much you would be willing to spend, how much you would be willing to give to keep that same 1,000 dinars for 10 years. Now, the Mishnah is interested in using the language of how much you would be willing to give, because the Mishnah knows that the Torah prohibition is we don't loan a fellow Jew money with interest.
They're not talking about interest. They're talking just return of a loan.
We're talking now how much money, if I say that he's got only 30 days to pay it back, but he says that he had 10 years and we find out that the witnesses were lying. I take the 30-day term and I think about how much would a person be willing to give to keep 1,000 dinars on hand for 30 days versus how much would a person be willing to give to keep 1,000 dinars on hand for 10 years. So I basically assess what sounds like what? A fee. I think of a fee that could be assessed for the potential use of the money. It's not. What's that?
It sounds like interest to me.
Oh, it might sound like that, but we're looking at the specific language of the Mishnah just for right now to realize that we have to be careful about these discussions. And that's why it says, Beinotnan mikan. We have this notain verb. We have a verb that's give, talks about the kavanah, the intentionality of one who would be willing to give a certain amount to keep a certain amount of money on hand. So let's say that I just needed to make sure I had it on hand and I didn't really spend it and I'm not in my repayment period. I didn't figure out how many payments that I'm going to make on this loan. I didn't figure out whether or not you're charging me 3 1/4 or 4. I didn't think, no, that's not the discussion for the Mishnah. Because immediately then we would all say, what? I thought you couldn't loan a Jew with interest. See, this is a little bit of the way that the economic realities of the Jewish people come to be understood by readers of the ancient texts. You can already say that we understand the Torah's ruling, but now in order to kind of make a distinction, you know, for some people, they say that the little tax laws that help folks are loopholes, but other people can just call them distinctions. You ever heard that? So this is a distinction. I'm not charging him interest. There's a certain user fee here for the money. Sounds like what the Mishnah is really purporting. I'm reading that and pushing that really hard. Anybody else have a different read? I'll share the screen again if you want to see the text and the language. Ron, go ahead.
It's called current value. The concept is current value.
Right, net current value.
Yeah.
Well, isn't that a little bit of a different?
Economy.
Isn't that a little bit of a different issue, right? It's not saying what's the current value on the currency market. As I understand current value, we take from the value of the 1,000 dinars, we look at it upon the currency market, and we say, what's the difference between the current value of the money versus the dollars I hold or the dinars I hold? That's a little different here than the fee that's assessed, no?
Yeah, it's like a net present value. If you would take the future value of the money and what is that worth today, buried underneath that is the interest, effectively, that you have to assume some interest that you would have gotten.
Uh-huh.
There is a current value and there is a future value. If this is 1,000 zuz for 10 years, you give me 200 now, I will make out of it 1,000 in 10 years. That's the current value that I'm ready to accept and forget about the 1,000. I will give it to me and I will deal with it on my own. That's the current value of the future loan.
Oh, and you take the risk, because whether or not you
give me 200
200 into 1,000,
joules and that's it. We separate. That's the
very
current
good.
value of that loan.
But it's a two-step process, if I get it. The first step is making an assessment of the value to assuming that the transaction occurred as we're talking about it. But the second step is assigning the net present value of that contract. So I think there were two determinations of present value. It's sort of net present value squared or something, because I think there are two separate steps you have to take here.
So explain those two as they go, Barry. What are the two in your thinking?
So the first one is this issue of whether I'm going to get the money back in 30 days or I'm going to get the money back in 10 years.
Okay.
So there's a value to that, okay? But now if I'm going to make somebody pay a penalty, I now have to take an assessment of what the net present value is of having that previous value assessed. Just like we did in the example just before, because somebody's now having to pay for that benefit, right?
Very good.
So we're bringing in a new party who's looking over this and looking at it as a derivative, because they're not part of the initial transaction. So the person stepping in the derivative has to make an assessment of the net present value of what that value was that was originally determined for having the 10-year versus the 30 days. I'm not an economist, so please, take everything I say with more than a grain of salt. But conceptually, that's the way I imagine the way it would work.
Well, here's the twists that the Gemara throws right away about any kind of thinking about how much this loan is worth if it's going to be written for a 10-year term, right? Because what's the problem with that in Jewish law? I mean, I tried to get us around the problem of interest.
We're going to have a sabbatical coming up.
We're going to have a sabbatical year. Here's the kasha. Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Amar Shmuel. Rabbi Yehuda says that Shmuel taught, Hamal ve'et chavero le'eser shanim, the one who lends his money for a period of 10 years, shvi'it mishamatato, the sabbatical year abrogates the debt. V'afal gav dehashta lo karenan be lo yigosh, sofati lide lo yigosh. And even though now during the sabbatical year, we do not yet read concerning his loan, the prohibition, he shall not exact it of his neighbor and his brother because the Lord's release has been proclaimed, as the time for repayment has not yet arrived. Ultimately, when the time for repayment arrives, he will come to a situation where the prohibition, he shall not exact it, applies. Therefore, like all other debts, it is abrogated by the sabbatical year. So there's a little bit of a complication that he brings forward. You think it's the sabbatical year is going to totally cancel it. But we could say we don't actually collect it now. Maybe we could collect it later. No, because ultimately you don't collect it is what applies here. Mativ Rav Kahana.
But Rabbi Gamliel put a prosbol that says that in the 7 years, it's the synagogue or the temple owns the loan and then it goes back.
Okay, so Ron's bringing in something that we were going to bring up a little later, but since you brought it up, Ron, good. Let's say that we know the law from a different tractate of the Talmud that says that if I want a longer term or I want to make a loan that starts out right next to a sabbatical year or Shemitah year, what's going to happen? It's going to lead Jewish moneylenders or people with enough resources, it's going to lead them to not make loans for their brothers and sisters. So what did we really see get developed within the Jewish legal corpus, something called the prosbul. We have a way to allow for that loan to be owned by a legal representative of the court or the court itself. There's all kinds of questions about who exactly owns it, but it's not the individual who makes the loan, and therefore the loan can be passed back to the malve, the one who makes the loan after the sabbatical year. So you could say that why am I even asking these questions in our situation? Because I know that there's a system that rectified the challenges that we faced, that longer term period loans would have been impossible, that loans right up to and next to the sabbatical year would have been distasteful to the point of people just would stop loaning money when it was necessary to loan money, when people were looking for loans. Well, it seems like we have to suspend a little bit of that knowledge and or suspend a little bit of that assumption in order to function within the legal discussion that's going on over here in our Talmudic passage. We need to push aside the knowledge that there's such a thing as prosbul and see if they bring that up, number one. Number two, do they have some other way around the problem that prosbul came to alleviate, came to address? Because we might be in a stratum of the Gemara that uses a different approach. We might have committee notes from the finance committee that don't include the prosbul as a category of solution for this problem, but might have a different solution or a different limud or a different way of understanding. What do I do if I want to make a 10-year term? And I am going to have every time a sabbatical year come within the 10-year period. So what I want to do the next time we'll start with this, we want to read the Gemara with open eyes, with suspension of what we know about this institution that allowed the court to hold the loan, which is called prosbul, that Ron just mentioned. And we'll see what the discussion rolls into and which verses apply and how they apply in order to come at the sabbatical year problem. Because I will tell you, to give away the answer to the first question that I proposed, do they bring the matter of prosbul to bear to solve the problem? The answer is no. So we're in a very different kind of conscious financial discussion here that might allow for a 10-year term on a loan, even given the reality of sabbatical years. And we have to compare and contrast that afterwards to which one sounds like the more reasonable way or better way or not, because will they get into that discussion? You thought they might? Well, at least they're not having it here. That's what Tosafot are good for, because they will start to take two different sections of two different Masechtot, two different tractates, and they'll start to say, well, isn't this just like that? Or how is it different from that? So that's a little bit of what's going to go on. All right, so that's where we'll leave it for tonight. And from artful and decorated ketubas and brides and grooms to loans and terms, but conspiring witnesses, all in all, shouldn't be allowed to corrupt the courts.
Bobby and I have a son-in-law who for many years traded derivatives. I'm going to tell him the first derivative. I just found out where the first derivative came from.
Terrific. Terrific.
Thank you very much, Rabbi.
Thank
Nice
you.
to see
Thank
everyone.
you, Rabbi. Great.
Good
night.
Thank you. Till
Good to
next
see you.
week.
Laila Tov.
Good night.
Laila Tov.